Well, Jacinda Ardern put in place some of the toughest lockdown conditions anywhere in the world, certainly outside of China, thinking she could pursue a zero COVID policy. And in June 2020, she announced that she got there, that they'd eradicated COVID from New Zealand. Of course, now things are very different. I mean, the latest figures in New Zealand, there have been around 330,000 COVID deaths per million population. That's slightly fewer than Australia. But still in the same zone. When it comes to COVID deaths, the figures I've got, Oliver, 400 Australian deaths per million stand at 482. Australia slightly lower at 476, Japan at 269. Now, to put that in context, of course, the UK have many times more deaths as most European and American countries do. But, you know, she did not achieve what she said she would do, did she? Which was to keep the curve flattened until there was a vaccine that was capable of controlling transmission. None of that happened.
Well, she kept COVID out of the country largely for a couple of years, so we can give her that. We had the first real COVID wave in New Zealand once the country was vaccinated. So if you compare the cumulative deaths in New Zealand to the cumulative deaths in the US or in Europe, you can see that, of course, we are still way behind these figures that we would have seen in other places. So in that sense, it has worked. What hasn't worked is, of course, the delivery of the vaccine, for example. We were very slow to implement it, and that meant we were slow to reopen the country. We were slow to reopen the borders. I mean, the last bit of the border opening only happened last week. So basically, for 2.5 years, New Zealand turned itself into a hermit kingdom with borders that were virtually closed to non-New Zealanders and very hard to cross, even for New Zealanders. So we had cases here where people tried to get into the country to be with their loved ones, to be with their families at times of, deaths or marriages or whatever celebrations they had. They couldn't get in. We had the most interesting case, perhaps, with a New Zealand journalist, Charlotte Bellis, who was stuck overseas while pregnant. She wanted to give birth in New Zealand and couldn't get in. Unfortunately, she didn't have a visa for anywhere else. And so because she had previously reported from Afghanistan, she asked the Taliban whether they would give her asylum. And the Taliban were kinder to Charlotte Bellis than even her own government in New Zealand. So it took a media storm until the New Zealand government allowed a pregnant New Zealander to get back into the country. So can you imagine that? So this is the government that liked to portray itself as kind and interested in their citizens' well-being. But in practice, it meant they were quite cruel to a number of New Zealand families, really locking them out of their own country.
Yeah, I mean, the basic freedoms that were surrendered in New Zealand and elsewhere, but notably in New Zealand, were something I guess you and I would never have expected to see in a democratic country. Do you think that those, have we now put those behind us, or is there a danger that some of those measures that were introduced, some of those intrusive measures, may be used in other circumstances or continue in some way?
Well, for the largest part, fortunately, we have left them behind. But it has given us a precedent. The precedent is actually that it shows politicians what you can do if the population lets you get away with it. So that was the most shocking thing, really, to see the compliance of the New Zealand people, to see how far New Zealand people are willing to go along with the government imposing quite draconian measures. I mean, the lockdowns we had here in New Zealand, they were probably much harsher than lockdowns, say, in European countries, probably on par with what happened in Victoria, Australia. But yes, it was quite shocking to see how compliant such a population can be.